Today's session we're looking at mood disorders and suicide. This category breaks down into what we call unipolar and bipolar mood disorders. Uni meaning one, bi meaning two. The category is made up of major depressive episode, major depressive disorder, dysthymia and double depression. And then on the bipolar side, so the two polars, because a person experiences moods that transcend two poles, we have bipolar 1, bipolar 2, and cyclothymia. When you look at the DSM, you'll also see that there's mood disorder not otherwise specified, where that's a category where people kind of have symptoms that might overlap both, and we're actually not quite sure at that stage what is happening, because often the onset of a mood disorder occurs maybe later in a person's life, but I'll get to that a bit later. So mood disorders are generally a category that speak about deviations of mood. Okay, layperson we might say 4 seasons in a day, okay, or they're grumpy, or today they're happy, or they're so unpredictable. We often use a term diurnal swing, which has to do with how do you wake up feeling, how are you feeling mid-morning, and how are you feeling late afternoon, and how are you feeling in the evening. We also look sometimes at seasonal affective disorder, which is, does someone's mood change according to the seasons? Most of us are, when we reach our adult stage, meant to have a relatively stable mood. Yes, we can be a bit irritable or grumpy, but our general mood, our general affect, our general way of being with people is being quite stable. If a person experiences themselves as quite emotionally volatile, that they're tearful, angry, or their thinking's quite negative one day and then the next day they seem quite optimistic, all of these are things that would describe somebody in the mood disorder. So a person might present and say, often family members complain, everybody says I'm moody, or I just don't understand, or for weeks and weeks and weeks I've just had no energy. Now we're looking at a mood disorder. Let's start with major depressive episode. It's said to be the most common. It's said to occur more frequently in women. However, that might also have to do with how the criteria are laid out in the DSM. The way depression is described as being a loss of interest, a loss of energy in things that you were previously interested in, sometimes a loss of optimism or a loss of concentration, as well as having a biological component. Sometimes that you can't sleep at all, the sleeplessness, which could be an initial sleeplessness, initial insomnia, you're struggling to fall asleep, or middle insomnia, you're struggling to stay asleep, or terminal insomnia, you're struggling to you wake up at 4 or 5 in the morning and then you can't go back to sleep again. Changes in eating pattern, you want to eat all the time, or you've completely lost your appetites. And then often a measure is what we call libido, which is your sexual energy or your sexual drive. And that's often also considered to be a sort of creative life force. So if we see changes in a person in terms of their biological functioning, struggle to concentrate, a sense of hopelessness, a sense of helplessness that has been going on for an extended period of time, then we say that they are experiencing a depression. Now, we often throw the terms I feel depressed around quite lightly in the world, or I feel blue. And I think this is why it's very important to make use of the criteria outlined in the DSM that particularly stipulate how long a person needs to be experiencing these symptoms. And the criteria says for most days, not all days, most days, for a period of 2 weeks, and that there need to be a certain number of these symptoms that you need to experience. So you need to kind of tick off on the list. And then lastly, that these criteria are causing impairment or the person's inability to function like they usually do. So I could be feeling a bit blue or a bit depressed, or I can feeling, what's the point, or a bit hopeless at times. But if it's not impairing how I'm functioning, or it's not creating so much distress or debilitating me, then I probably would not diagnose someone with depression. Depression can, however, be considered to be mild, moderate, or severe. Severe cases can be really bad. I once did work with a young girl who, it was so severe, she didn't get out of bed for days and days and days. And I remember her recalling to me how there'd be days that she'd be lying in bed where she would need to get up to go to the toilet to urinate. And she was so depressed that she thought to herself, if I just lie here long enough, the feeling would go away. And she lived on her own, which is often also what happens, is that people don't feel like socializing, so they start isolating. Or sometimes in the reverse, because they're depressed and a bit negative, their friends stop inviting them, so it's a bit of a chicken or an egg situation. So it feels worse and worse and worse. And this young girl, I remember she reported that she didn't leave her flat for 3.5 weeks. And there was one stretch of time where she didn't get up for 3.5 days. As I say, not even to go to the bathroom. So that is a severe depression. Okay? And I think this is important to understand, so that, as I say, we don't just throw these words around so easily, I'm depressed. Okay? This is a proper clinical condition that we need to look at. Now, depression is sometimes considered to be coming from the inside, which is a sort of a biological causation, and sometimes a depression can be triggered by something that we've experienced, a difficulty in our lives, a death, a grief, but again, certain criteria need to be met to be diagnosed with depression, and there needs to primarily be a loss of interest, a loss of motivation, a hopelessness and a helplessness. The research seems to show that in severe depression, antidepressants can certainly be useful. But we know for the mild and moderate depressions that counseling is highly effective if a person attends therapy regularly. But in the first stages of depression, to get someone to attend therapy and counseling regularly is often very hard, because you, as I say, have people who don't even want to leave their bed or leave their flat. So often family members might bring someone, or somebody might be battling for a long time. In an ideal world, if someone did experience these symptoms and come quite soon, we could often prevent them having a major depressive disorder if they got treated quite soon. Cognitive behavioral therapy has been found quite effective, but not only CBT. All therapies have been shown to be very effective in treating a depression. People are quick to grab for the antidepressants because we want a quick fix. But I would really encourage people to seek the support of a counsellor if they're battling with depression. When someone does come see me, I think what's also an important question to ask is there a family member that has battled with a mood difficulty before? Now, the previous generations didn't really seek the help of a counsellor. So it's sometimes good to say, was there an uncle that always got drunk at Christmas and always fell off the chair and was a bit grumpy, and he was fine and then he was grumpy again? That might have been someone in the family who had depression that was using alcohol to self-medicate. Or was there an auntie who turned out to be that horrible word, a spinster? And sometimes people laugh and say, shame, she had a disappointment in love and she was always moody and grumpy and never very cheery. That might have been a family member who had an untreated depression, someone who never recovered from a disappointment. And so it's important to ask these questions, and whether there is someone in the family who seems to maybe have battled with their mood before. And the reason being is in line with what you would have seen earlier in your prescribed material, the diathesis stress model. The diathesis stress model seems to indicate, and the research backs it up, that a lot of mental health conditions like depression have a genetic component. What that means is that if you have someone in your family who has previously had a depression, it doesn't mean you're definitely going to have a depression, but it does mean you are more susceptible, you are more at risk of having depression. And if that person with a genetic vulnerability has a traumatic situation have happened to them, or a disappointment or a crisis, it is at that time that a depression might develop. So the diathesis stress model is saying if they don't have resources, if they have a psychological trauma and they've got a genetic vulnerability to depression, this person probably will develop a depressive episode or depressive disorder. So we kind of need to tick 3 boxes: genetic vulnerability, psychological trauma, and no access to resources, social skills, social support. And this is really where we come in as counsellors, is we can't always control people's genetic vulnerabilities to certain conditions. I cannot control someone's genetic vulnerability to depression or heart disease. I can't prevent them having a disappointment or a tragedy in life. Sadly, things do happen. But what we as counsellors can control is the social support and the resources that the person has. And even if I tick the first 2 categories, if I can cross the 3rd category and say, no, yes, they've got vulnerability, they've got a trauma, but they've got social support, we can actually prevent someone slipping into a depressive episode. And we can also, if we provide that social support, try and reduce the impact of the depression on their lives. And so that's really where we come in as counsellors, just to teach life skills, teach techniques, which depression, for example, is helping them remain active, bringing support in when they have the traumas, watching what they eat, not isolating themselves by refusing to socialize, doing some self-talk, going for therapy when they're going through difficult transitional times in their lives, changing jobs, whatever it might be. So there's a lot that we can do as counsellors. Major depressive episode is when a person has a 2-week period of feeling this. Major depressive disorder is when they have regular episodes of depression. And a double depression is when a person has major depressive episodes, but they also have what we call dysthymic mood disorder. Now, if we had to think of this as normal, as sort of level field, the person with dysthymic mood disorder does not drop as low as a person with depression, but they're someone that constantly functions just a little bit under par. Okay? This is the person who's at risk of being described as having a negative personality or always being in a bad mood. They do well. They don't have as many symptoms as depression, but they're not functioning as optimally as they could. And this is a person who's experienced this for more than a year. Dysthymic mood disorder. Double depression is when it's someone who is underperforming like this and not feeling energized, feeling helpless, hopeless, all those things for a long period of time, a year. And then on top of that, they have an episode which drops them even lower. And that is what we term double depression. Now, on the other side is the bipolars, okay? Bipolar 1, bipolar 2, and cyclothymia. Let me start with bipolar 1. The key factor to bipolar 1 is that the person must have had a manic episode. Now, what's a manic episode? A manic episode is elevated mood, excessive amounts of energy, inability to sleep, have 1,000 thoughts racing through their head, sometimes a feeling of anxiety, busy, a sense of everything's possible, a grandiosity. This is just amazing. I'm going to write a book today, and tomorrow I think I'm going to, I've always wanted to open a shop, and I'm going to open a shop. I'm a brilliant florist, so I'm going to open a florist, and I think I'm going to ask my friend to come from America, and they might speak this fast, and they've got a million ideas and a million possibilities of things that they can do. They are seemingly high. Okay, fast, energized, little sleep, very creative. People who are creative can churn out 20 songs, 30 paintings when they're in this elevated state. The problem is that their body can't sustain this, and so they can't keep up at this pace. So bipolar 1 is someone who episodically has these very high highs and also depressions. Bipolar 2 is very similar to bipolar 1, but they never have a manic episode. They have what we call a hypomanic episode. So if this is the high point of where bipolar 1 person might reach, where they think anything is possible, the person with bipolar 2 goes higher than normal, but only goes to maybe halfway. And I think the person is elevated, they're feeling more energized, but it's often undetectable because they're not acting weirdly, they're not speaking super fast, they're not sleeping, they're not spending whole bunches of money on a credit card that they don't need. They've just got more energy. So the person with bipolar 2 often goes undiagnosed because they're having ups and downs. They're a lot more energy today, and then suddenly I drop for a couple of weeks. You'll see the time periods in the DSM about how long each of these periods need to last. But it's often quite a complex and detailed process of asking questions because we have what we also call mixed episodes, where a person might experience the up and downs more frequently than other people. And bipolar mood disorders, the minute you, whether it's bipolar 1 or bipolar 2, the minute you recognize persons having a high, I think this is when it's time to refer to a psychiatrist or a general practitioner if there's not a psychiatrist working nearby. Whilst I think a counsellor could provide a lot of assistance with depression, I think the minute we start hearing these highs and we start recognizing, you need to know this is something that needs help. And sadly, bipolar is a chronic condition. On the other hand, it's a good thing because we do have medication available. Usually the medication is a form of lithium. Those of you who did science at school will remember your periodic table where we had sodium and oxygen. Lithium is a chemical element that they put in the medications that help the person stabilize their mood so that they can function. Now, there's a wonderful documentary by the British comedian, writer, and actor Stephen Fry. You'll find it on YouTube. Unfortunately, I've never been able to track down the original documentary, but it's called My Life as a Manic Depressive. And Stephen Fry writes about his condition of having bipolar. He himself does not have bipolar. He has cyclothymia, which is just similar to bipolar, but it's little ups and downs. It's not as intense. He laughs and says it's like bipolar light. But what Stephen Fry puts so aptly in that documentary that he's made, and there are also some interviews on YouTube that you'll find of him, he says the thing that people don't understand by mood disorders is that often the general public says, pull yourself together. He says mood disorders is like having your own internal weather. So a person with bipolar or cyclothymia, today it feels gloomy, cloudy, thundery, rainy. And for absolutely no reason, no explanation, tomorrow the sun is shining. It is bright. It is the best day I've ever had. It's beautiful. I can do anything. It's the most incredible day. And he said, just like we can't control the weather, I can't determine whether it's going to be sunny or rainy today. He said the very same thing is true for people with bipolar mood disorder or cyclothymia. They cannot pull themselves together. They cannot simply control the weather. You cannot say to them, cheer up, be a bit sunny, be a bit smiley. You cannot say, pull yourself together, come on, or calm down. Okay, it is out of their control. And for this reason, they do need medication. Sadly, as Stephen Fry says, many famous world leaders, artists, musicians, actors, do struggle with bipolar. There are more people who have this than are maybe well known. And people don't like taking the medication because they miss the highs. They miss those happy, wonderful days where they can do absolutely anything. So I think part of our role as a counsellor with bipolar and people who battle with bipolar is to help encourage them to remain medication compliant, help teach them about their illness, and help their families have a better understanding that people with major depressive episode, dysthymia, bipolar 1, bipolar 2, and cyclothymia are not difficult, moody, irritable, sad people. These are people with a medical condition that counseling together with medication can really help them be more functional in their lives and really live a good life. And I think this is vitally important because your study guide also shows how high the suicide rate is with mood disorders. It's incredibly high. One would think major depressive episode. It's actually people with bipolar 1 who have the highest suicide risk, often when they are at that high. It's not only when they're at their low point. So I think in terms of the suicide risk, it's very good to know your crisis management skills, know when to step in as a crisis, and this is something that we as counsellors also need to be very vigilant and mindful of when we're working with someone with mood disorders, is always err on the side of caution. Rather, when the person says they're feeling low or they're feeling like they're not wanting to carry on, rather step in and do your crisis management than run the risk of it leading to a sadder situation like suicide. Just to conclude, suicide does not only occur with the mood disorders. Often the anxiety disorders, the eating disorders might also have a risk of suicide as well. But certainly there's a high comorbidity with mood disorders and suicide. So that's a general overview for a very, very broad category. Keep reading because many of your clients will probably be presenting with a mood disorder.